maybe I should make a video on this. Once upon a time, I had an idea to make a review of Persona 4 Golden, a game I love and respect quite a lot, but for various reasons the script was never assembled and a promise to do it before Persona 5's release never came to be, even though I certainly had the opportunity. I am not making that mistake a second time, though I certainly hemmed and hawed about getting this game in the first week. My project list is piling up and what few other obligations I have are getting in the way. Plus the last time I instantly played the sequel to one of my most loved games of the last generation, well, I think I need to lay off Mankind Divided for a while. But here we are, Shin Megami Tensei Persona 5, the fourth sequel to a spin-off that arrived after countless spin-offs of the third sequel to a spin-off. Unless you consider Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment as separate games, which you probably shouldn't. So here's the premise. After intervening on a drunken man shaking around a woman, a youth from the suburbs is charged with assault and placed on probation, being forced to move into the attic of a disgruntled cafe owner in Tokyo, and transfers to Shujin Academy, where his presence is dogged with rumours of what he actually did, and his teacher resents having to babysit this headache to the administration. Also, the story is told in flashback, and the game really starts with this kid getting the shit kicked out of him in a police interrogation. So, what happens when the systems that facilitate our justice system fail to see through the morals behind that sentiment? Like, say, if the gym teacher starts messing around with his students, abusing them physically and emotionally, but the people involved are afraid to speak up for fear of even worse reprisal, and if the administrative body has its hands tied because of the strife it will bring if they opposed him, you do what these kids do. Stumble upon the metaphysical embodiment of that teacher's darkest desires, and awaken to your inner virtuous rebel. That's the premise behind this game's personas, by the way. I assume the basic appropriation of Jungian theory that guides the series is known to most of you by now, but Persona 5 does an impressive job of divvying up the metaphors a bit. Even though the overall experience of dungeons, monster collecting, social links, and unravelling the supernatural mystery alongside the real-world problems you directly solve is as present now as it has been for a while, it's been recontextualised in some pretty nifty ways, all in the service of supporting the game's thesis statement of making your own justice in lieu of the typical options presented. For example, Persona has sometimes struggled with making its titular beings particularly noteworthy or integral to the characters that wield them, but 5 comes pretty close, as all of the main personas are based on historical figures known for going against the grain and usually being punished in a cruel and unusual way, such as Goemon and Yoana, and when they evolve, they then turn into tricksters from mythology, like Susanoo and Goku, but each reinforces each character's brand of revolt and help to capture the essence of quite what they're going against, which helps bolster Persona's most critically defining attribute, its characterization. Though the general consensus of 5's cast being less bombastic and certainly less memorable than that of 4 is probably true, the writing is less reliant on singular defining traits and gives the cast a bit more flexibility and just enough more depth to bolster everyone's driving stories. Yuji's backstory that defines his mindset going forward is winding and complex, involving numerous misunderstandings amongst his peers, which means the solution to his complex isn't staring him in the face, and he's the first character you team up with. Further missions into other people's hearts will see a few more people joining the Phantom Thieves, and they all add something to the overall dynamic because they've each had fairly different life experiences that have shaped their personalities, including one character so sheltered and focused on their art they miss every social cue thrown at them. Yusuke is kind of the Gundam Tanaka of the Persona series, but they all have one thing in common and one thing to fight for: mistrust of scheming adults who take advantage of the young and get away with it. Previous Persona games had you fighting either a vague supernatural threat or uncovering the real enemy as the game goes along, but Persona 5 is distinctly episodic with how segmented its levels are, as each palace is based on a manifestation of some real-life villain's darkest desires. The gym teacher views his school as a castle with students of subservient subjects. The art teacher stealing his pupils' work thinks his rundown shack is a museum, and so on. So each dungeon is based on a singular circular theme with narrative thrusts to match, and a properly ascending scale, but not too much continuity to the overall story until after they've concluded. But I'm not complaining. Persona 5 feels like a game they really wanted to do right, and every narrative point feels as explored as they could be, given the core concept. I'm kind of amused they've had to keep rewriting the rules of the Persona mythos, but the changes made adequately reflect and reinforce the events on screen. Your partners don't really have a strong sense of personal denial. All they need is some measure of willpower to awaken to their inner selves, and then they get to, use their personas. Instead, it is the villains who have shadows this time, and those rule the respective palaces you have to infiltrate. It's not just a nice inversion, it's also a better avenue for this overt characterization of shadows to attach them to people who are already bad guys, and it gives much better credence to there being a manifestation of the subconscious instead of the problems of the shadows being so obvious as they arguably were in 4. The shadows in 5, particularly in the game's first half, hit harder and are both funnier and scarier because they're closer to the core of what makes these arsehole adults act the way they do, while still keeping some measurable distance to give their real selves plausible ability to act affable, which is a big part of how they are able to get away with these things. But the big reason, and the theme Persona 5 seems to explore the most, is because the systems in place are allowing them to do so through loopholes, or because they simply have the pool to do so. No one wants to bust the gym teacher because he's an Olympic gold medalist leading the volleyball team to victory, and the stuff he's doing isn't that bad, right? Even the altercation which starts the game is a gross injustice that unfortunately no one can do anything about. But these kids who have to rise to the challenge aren't self-centered renegades. The thieves have the code of honor, having to unanimously decide on a target before going through with the palace raiding, which regulates their personal stakes in the matter, even though it was a very personal scenario that drives each to join them in the first place. And it makes for a strong contrast in character between each party that is still compelling because you can see the steps that led everyone to perform the actions they do. And it's this point of highlighting motive and background that justifies one of the more contentious inclusions, that is of the character of the young detective, Goro Akechi. You probably know the gist of how this sort of character interaction goes. You meet up with him on public access television, debating each other over the Phantom Thieves just as they start gaining momentum, with him none the wiser as to your identity. But as typical as he seems, his presence is necessary. He does things by the book, but he believes in that book for a reason. And it's nice that the game had the good sense to include that counterpoint, but still intelligently set it up to thwart it, not as a straw man, but as a showcase of the limitations of his mindset. Something talked about as soon as the first victim of the thieves is that they have to bust him by stealing his heart, or he just won't be claimed at all. If this all sounds more like a critical essay than a review, it's only because I want to make the point that Persona 5, despite the straightforward setup, has a lot going on over the full course of the game that not only justifies the length, but still makes the adventure actively compelling. And really, I'm just scratching the surface. Play through Persona 5 and you'll see discussion and dissection of the bounds of emotion, survivor's guilt, hero worship, political corruption, personal responsibility versus social responsibility, the definition of family and trust, and, as Persona is wont to do, an explanation for the enigmatic machinations of the human mind and how it conflicts with actions that may only be explained as being driven by the human soul. The game may only take place in Tokyo, but the scale of the narrative is impeccable, and it really does go just about everywhere it really can without becoming something else entirely. It remains, throughout, a story about corruption and guided vigilante justice, and with that thought in mind, we can finally talk about the game itself. The dungeons in Persona 5 are the palaces of each villain of the week, which are supernatural constructs of how they regard the environments they reside in or frequent. And the goal is to reach the inner sanctum to secure a route through which eventually you will steal their inner treasure, more or less the item that began their descent down the road of sin. To fit with the whole thief motif, many of these are based on classic heist scenarios, like a museum, a bank, a casino. You even get to play Lara Croft in one level. Far from the randomly generated dungeons of old, each palace is designed room by room with an aesthetic in mind, and puzzles and obstacles to match. When you're in the bank, you have to turn off security systems to work your way past multi-locked doors. When you're in the pyramid, you have to escape from traps straight out of Indiana Jones. When you're in space, you have to go through some funky airlock puzzles. These sound like small additions, but they do a lot to create a fun sense of atmosphere area for each level. The game's main mechanical thrust, which I'll elaborate on in a bit, is attrition and regulation, and Persona has sometimes struggled to make every area meaningful in light of this, but with 5's unique dungeons they finally managed to make every area have a real sense of place, with good level design and well-timed puzzles that fit the themes they're in. Now, when I said that Persona's main mechanical thrust is attrition, I wasn't kidding. There aren't a lot of consistent aesthetic threads between these dungeons, bar one. They are all very long. True to form, each dungeon has a limit on the amount of in-game days you have to complete them, and these time limits are all regulated by a peripheral real-world event that will affect the player character's standing. For example, you have to change the gym teacher's heart before the next board meeting or you'll be expelled. Small as it is, I like the change in dynamic from the last two of this one. Persona 3 measured milestones and sprung super dungeons upon you at certain dates, and Persona 4 had definitive end dates marked by certain weather patterns, but each time limit in 5 is just a practical date to steal someone's heart to solve an impending real-world deadline by proxy. I don't know, it's just kinda cool that they're governed by something really tangible to contrast all the parts where you're fighting demons. Combat is your standard fare. The only difference that stares you in the face is that the enemies aren't 10 or so monsters with varying palettes, but actually the usual lineup of SMT demons who also comprise the personas you can recruit. Otherwise, if you've played SMT before, you probably know what to expect. Elements, weaknesses, the one more system. However, the true difficulty comes from conservation. Your party will tell you to pace yourself and swap out low HP members, but the real measure of ongoing fighting spirit is the SP gauge, used to cast spells and mostly used to hit enemy weak points to stagger them and get every all-out attack you can. Determining weaknesses usually requires burning through SP to cycle through different elements, so if you make too many incorrect guesses, especially with the main character Joker, you can screw yourself as the dungeon goes on. Items to replenish SP are very rare, and usually the only way is simply to leave the dungeon for the day, even though getting it in one is the most efficient course of action for obvious reasons. So what you have is a battle system that makes individual battles worse, but the overall metagame more interesting as a mixture of short and long-term resource and time management. I did all but 2 dungeons in a single day, and I felt the burn in the latter half, because you usually have to actually use health items instead of healing spells by that point, which bites into your bank account. And your yen will mostly go towards Persona Fusion and Persona Buyback and into new weapons and equipment. So how efficiently you're able to spend money in between expeditions and how leveled up you are, it kind of becomes the grading system to measure how well you scanned each dungeon and how well you saved your money and items. On its own, I don't think this would have been particularly interesting, but there are a number of nuances and fun tidbits that are added to each dungeon for more layers to the experience. True to the thief aesthetic, there's a tacked on stealth mechanic, which doesn't work all that well, but what you gonna do? On top of that, there's this whole subsystem regarding security status that affects ambush bonuses and how much leniency the stealth system gives you with its own little rules. And of course there is a lot of loot to collect and a few optional treasures for any aspiring phantom thief to try their luck at retrieving. The point is that all of these get you to think ahead and track things a little bit, alongside the resource-based battle system, the dungeon puzzles, and the investigation. A lot of these elements were present in some form or another in previous entries, but it's the actual level design that elevates the meat of the gameplay beyond tedium and into something engrossing. This is to say nothing of the boss battles, which are straight up awesome. Of course, the gameplay and strategy of Persona 5 go beyond the dungeons, especially with regards to long-term management, and a huge part of the experience between dungeons is leveling up social links, or as this game puts it, confidants. The basic rules of social links dictating experience given to new Persona fusions remains, but Persona 5 is way kinder about giving even more incentive to tackle these. Most confidants also give either a passive bonus, like a few extra random abilities and effects in battle, to some extra activities to bolster your items or maximize your time usage. Get to a certain relationship level with the maid and you can call her to do an errand on your behalf that would usually eat up a full time slot. But on top of that, you might have to reach certain levels of personal social statistics before you can do an activity or a social link. Intellect, charm, and so on. It's a complicated symphony, but Persona 5 might have the best implementation of all this yet, simply because of how much of it comes back to the heart of the gameplay and adds to the bigger picture, rather than just being diversions during the downtime. Maintaining a mental roadmap of what to level up next, who to see, and when to do it, in between the scripted events that eat your days for you, is a sometimes frustrating, but still pretty engaging way to get you to interact with the world and the people around you. And oh, what a world! As another separating factor from the last game, which centered around a city boy moving to the country, Persona 5 sees a suburban youth being able to explore the sprawling space of Tokyo. And even with the myriad fast travel options available, the city is a sight to behold, when it's not loading in NPCs on the spot. It pains me to say, but the city projects a real sense of atmosphere, and it somehow has even more playing space than a dedicated Akihabara simulator. There's a humbling sense of homeliness when mingling with bystanders by day as an average citizen, which frames the Phantom Thieves experience as being likened to superheroes, as does happen in the later part of the game when word spreads of their existence. And it's just cool to look at and take in. And honestly, that's the whole game in a nutshell. Dungeon, social links, big block of scripted events, repeat. And yes, it gets a bit systematic and tiresome. I've complained before about JRPGs not being as invigorating over dozens of hours as game devs believe. But even with the uptick in playtime, I choose to stand by Persona 5. For multiple reasons. Now, I liked Persona 4 a lot, but you can really boil down the experience to dungeons, socialising, and the overall murder mystery, and there's not a lot of substance in between. In comparison, Persona 5 has a lot more going on. There's the long game with your stats and with your friends, there are the dungeons, there are the villains of the week, but there's also discussion around the circumstances with regards to those villains and how you deal with them, and with the current social climate that plays a bigger and bigger part in the story. I could never quite wait to see what would happen next in the main story, in the current episode, or even in the arcs of several social links which unravel both personal backstories and deep characterization. Even a lot of the little moments add so much to the overall experience, from the group chat on your mobile to each in-game movie having voiced dialogue, making pointed parodies of contemporary films.
Unless you can move at the speed of light, you'll never be able to go back to the future.
It is also, still, one of the few games to capture the understated beauty of quiet, solemn moments with friends. And this game even does that better, mixing in random events where two friends can meet up at once through happenstance, which is, much like in real life, an odd but gleeful moment when it comes up. Basically, Persona 5 might have a lot of downtime, but I never really thought there was a dull moment without something that added to the overall package. Oh wait. In between, or even during, the periods where you run through major dungeons, the party can visit Mementos, a cognitive world based on the mass collective unconscious of the citizens of Tokyo that steadily unlocks with the Phantom Thieves level of infamy. A randomly generated dungeon with set gates that open after each main story mission is cleared. It is here where you can complete side missions, claiming lower level shadows and fixing their hearts after people complaining about them on the unofficial fan site, or else just grind for levels, loot and personas as you see fit. Now, I think something like Mementos was necessary, especially between major palaces which collapse as soon as the treasure is stolen, but it still feels like a letdown after the fluid and intriguing main dungeons where they're integrated as FedEx and puzzles. In comparison, the makeup of Mementos is not something Atlus spent a long time on, nor was the average level curve to make grinding at all useful, and if they didn't give a shit, why should I? Honestly, your teammates' idle banter during Mementos seems more like an indictment against it than an addition to proceedings. If they have to have mind-numbing conversations about nothing to stop them from falling asleep, then it's no wonder that this failed the test. Not that all of the humour really lands as is. Yes, I'm going to complain about these moments, both for the reasons you expect and also because they're just getting long in the tooth. Persona 5's humour in general is way too repetitive. Oh, there are a lot of funny little lines and cute asides, but the big cutaways that lead up to belaboured gags have almost all been used before, and to diminishing effect. Can't we do anything different with a scenario on the beach, or involving a dressing room, or even with a school fair? Or of course with gay people. It was like when I saw Guardians of the Galaxy 2 only to find Drax doing most of the humour. Good sense of timing or no, you can see the jokes before they land, which is one of the first rules of comedy, getting to the punchline before your audience. But speaking of punchlines, somewhat, the narrative framing from the 3/4 mark or so makes me uncomfortable. The big twist of the game is honestly fairly easy to guess, but that's not to say it's bad at all. Thematically it's fine, but the reveal itself is so twisted and, sadly, cheats with player perspective. Moreover, the game still expects you to memorize one of the most innocuous, nondescript moments of the game for its smoking gun. The reveal of a major player comes down to a conversation about pancakes. Pancakes! And apparently everyone in the Thieves remembers that conversation to a T, which undercuts the whole point about little magical moments between buddies. I mean, I thought Contradiction was bad when the killer was revealed because they literally used the wrong duct tape to fix some broken glass, but this may be worse, and there are just a couple of other plot points in the upswing that get me. I don't consider this much of a spoiler. The guy that gets you in trouble right at the beginning of the game turns out to have a far bigger role as a villain later on. Even the cat calls it an oddly poetic twist. However, a minor plot point mentioned from Van is that of several other thwarted villains having ties to the major plan, which seems like a thematic contradiction to me. Most of the side characters in the Phantom Thieves had direct reason to get involved with the corresponding villain of each chapter they made their debut in, but a moral duty to pursue further endeavours while they had the power to continue. Tying so many side villains to the bigger picture feels like it goes against that, both because it has an undercurrent of fate to it, which is not nearly as poetic as a bunch of random kids just rising to the challenge as they see it, but also because it doesn't make a lot of sense. I can accept the Yakuza having ties to but an art director? And isn't it meant to be the personal hubris of these adults leading them to do their evil deeds rather than even if it was out of fear? Sorry, the point is the final acts don't feel particularly graceful with the scale they ascend to. This is especially true of the climax. Okay, so do you remember how the gas station attendant turned out to actually be a god, running a cosmic game judging the morals of everyone in a small town? I get the impression that Izanami no Okami, or whatever her name was, just pissed people off, but it made sense in the end for me. Persona 4 is about mistaken identity and lifting the veil, and the ties it makes to the supernatural and how cosmic forces might observe us is resonant enough to make up for how stupid easy it is to miss the true ending. They attempt a similar thing with Persona 5, and I just don't think it works nearly as well. I will say no more. Those are honestly the only big issues I have with the game, and if the biggest hang-up I have is that the framing gets a little lost as the ending tries to one-up itself, well, at least we can say the game had its heart in the right place. And it only bugs me so much because so much of the rest of the game approaches a grand level of aesthetic completion, with so many visual and narrative elements complementing each other. Persona 5 is a story about rogue justice set in the modern day through the eyes of a disgraced high school student that utilises well-worn elements of the Shin Megami Tensei ethos, and with that concept in mind, I honestly believe they took it as far as they could, into as many places they could, which for a game this long is very important. There are other minor quibbles. Shut the fuck up, Morgana, I don't want to go to bed. Do you really need to know about this kid who taught me to shoot by playing Time Crisis? I really don't know about this soundtrack stacked up to the others. But none of those could affect the overall power of the game. It's just kind of awe-inspiring to have a game worked on for as long as it was that honestly felt like all those years paid off. We laugh at those delays, and we should, but the final result is so dissonant from the original flyer I cannot imagine how an earlier version would have even looked. Being really candid, and if you know anything about me, this should be high praise, I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Hey, maybe once more DLC costumes come out, I will. And if they patch in the option to date Yusuke, I'd do it even if it had the prerequisite of playing it on Nightmare without dying once. But I'm also happy to just bask in it for a moment, because maybe this is why I haven't actually made a real video at all this year. Isolation was a From the Vaults episode. I've had so many personal hang-ups with my attachment to games, and especially as an auteurist in a medium infamously being choked to death by monolithic publishers pushing financial quotas above all else. I like a lot of games, but rare are the ones that let me see more in them than just fun and solid construction. But the sad cold reality is that I still find more of that in games than in any other medium in the mainstream. I've said this before, but music is too intangible to leave much of a mark in my mind, and modern Hollywood is just the biggest walking paradox. With games, I feel like I can bust loose. There's a lot more engagement to the process of indulging in their construction, even if it just comes to gameplay. And if there's a lot more to it, ooh. That's why I consider Persona 5 so great. They worked at it. They perfectly used supernatural metaphors to tell a story about the human condition. which might be one of the highest aspirations art can shoot for. Even though it's not quite transcendent, not like some other games I've played this year, it just made me so happy to get out of a game as much as I put in terms of time, patience, intelligence, and respect. But I've been getting better. I've learned not to demand that out of every game I play. The medium is, first and foremost, a hobby, and as big as I talk up Persona 5 thematically, I guess it took a game that was 85 hours long that I found simply emotionally fun enough that I would do it all over again to see it. Well, see it again, I guess. I've played a fair number of games since the last real review I did, mostly just to free myself from the faux-enforced burden of video production. I don't plan to talk about all of them, but after tackling this behemoth, I think I'm ready to step it up again. Although the next review might be an anime review.